So this is the first webinar that we are hosting. So thank you everybody for attending. And this is a two-part mini series with one of the most popular topics that we have been encouraged to focus on when we sent out a bit of a survey to the public, and that is geothermal, and specifically geothermal in Alberta. And so today's talk is it will be presented by Dr. Catherine Hickson. And then the second part of this presentation will be on March 31st, and that will be presented by Pt1, who are both here today. So thank you for being willing to be the first speakers for us on this webinar series. So the format today will be about a 45-minute presentation followed by questions and comments for about 15 minutes. The format of this Zoom meeting unfortunately doesn't allow for video or mics to be on for the attendees, the non-panelists. So if you do have any questions or comments, please just go ahead and add those into the comments section. And when Kathy is finished with her presentation, we'll be able to go through those and read them out and hopefully get a bit of a conversation going that way instead. There are other talks that are being organized right now, and we will make a point to highlight those for everybody at the end as well. So stick around for those before you leave if you're interested in coming for more webinar talks, free webinar talks every 2 weeks or so, twice a month is sort of the approximate scheduling currently. So I'm just going to stop sharing that slide here and just introduce Dr. Catherine Hickson, who will be presenting for us today. She is the Chief Geologist of Terrapin Geothermics and the CEO of Alberta No. 1, Terrapin's signature geothermal energy project, and Alberta's first conventional geothermal power and heat facility. Dr. Hickson is a globally respected geothermal resource development expert and now finds herself in the role of senior disruptor in Alberta's renewable energy space. She has spent significant time on projects in Chile, Peru, Italy, Iceland, and the US over the past 40 years, covering experiences from greenfield exploration to actually operating in the fields. Dr. Hickson is also the Vice President of Geothermal Canada, an organization founded in 1974 to assist Canadians and Canadian companies in the development of geothermal resources nationally and globally. So without any further ado, I will be passing the virtual mic over to Catherine. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah. And welcome everybody. And it's a delight to be invited to be one of your kickoff speakers, because certainly geothermal is the hot topic of the day. So my presentation is going to focus on what geothermal is and what we need to do as Albertans to grow the industry. Next week, or on the 31st, you're going to hear from Katie, and Katie is going to talk about the specifics. So mine is the arm waving generalist. Here's how we need to get everybody on board, and Katie is going to give you the details. So you're not going to hear much in terms of details from me, but we're hopefully I'm going to walk you through why we need to focus on geothermal in Alberta. So I'm going to just share my screen here, and hopefully I'm going to share the correct one. So I'm hoping that you see a single slide up. Got some nods. Okay, fabulous. This is great. So really, as I said, I'm going to focus on how do we grow a geothermal industry in Alberta. I'm going to talk about the hurdles, and specifically, I'm going to focus on this elephant. And I've used this, this image of an elephant to try to get people to understand the nature of the beast, the nature of the resource that you have in Alberta. But there are challenges. So even though we have this giant elephant, how we actually get projects and in fact grow an industry. We do not have an industry in Alberta yet. There are 3 projects. Our project, Alberta No. 1, is a conventional geothermal project. We have the Razor Energy Futerra project, which is essentially a hybrid system. So using fluids from an existing oil and gas field. And then we have the Ever closed loop system, which is basically in R&D at this point. So those are the 3 projects. So it's not an industry. And we're all trying to show that in fact it could be an industry. So let's talk about that elephant. So first of all, what is geothermal and why? So as Sarah said, I've been in this industry for 40 years, and I noticed that one of your upcoming speakers, the title of his talk is Choose Your Adventure. Well, 40 years ago, I chose an adventure, and that adventure was in geothermal. And at that point in time, it was mostly, I was working in high temperature systems. I'm actually a volcanologist. And so I was working around volcanoes, seeing lots of hot water. So it was more about, oh, you know, this is a really cool thing, as opposed to what it could do for our environment. But over the decades, the importance of things like geothermal's ability to help us reduce our greenhouse gases have become essentially the forefront. And what I have noticed in basically the last 2 years, is we've had a separation of geothermal in terms of support for geothermal from the price of a barrel of oil. But I'm going to talk about that in a bit. But these are the highlights. This is why geothermal. It is the greenest of the green in terms of renewable options. But we're in Alberta. We're in oil and gas country. And in Alberta, there are political problems, there are financial problems, and there are also technical problems. It is not just one size fits all. So from the financial, that's the ask of the government of Alberta, is to try to essentially help us overcome these very high capex. And I'm going to talk about that briefly as well. Political, we need a simplified process. Bill 36, a lot of people thought it was a great thing. Not such a great thing. There's a lot of problems that we need to deal with. And then on the technical side, it's really an understanding that although what we do in geothermal builds on and is the oil and gas industry is the foundation, it is different. And there are different aspects that we need to deal with. So this is the opportunity. Geothermal is going to help us in carbon sequestration. It's going to help us in terms of what our carbon credits are. We're going to be able to create a cascading use of brine. And in particular, it's going to help us get to net zero. And it's going to support the oil and gas industry. So geothermal is not about replacing the oil and gas industry. It is about supporting that industry. We're going to help expand Alberta's economy in areas like the growth of greenhouses. Food security is incredibly important. Industrial scale composting, aquaculture, agriculture drying. We're going to be able to create industrial clusters. These are industries that use oil and gas, creating fertilizer, petrochemical processes. We're going to actually be able to support those industries by helping them do sequestration. We're going to be able to support the forest manufacturing and also lithium. And I will get into how we're going to do this. But what I want you to think about is all of the things that geothermal can do. It's not just about hot water. So this is our project. And as I've already said, Katie will be talking about the details of the project. We have 2 sites. It's just south of the city of Grand Prairie. One of those sites we're calling Wapiti, and the other is the Gold Creek site. The important thing about them is they're very well situated. They're close to transportation, rail lines and highways, as well as power transmission. And we have an industrial park in both areas that we will be supplying with lovely green geothermal hot water. So this is the opportunity for investors. So I want you to think about, you are an investor and you're looking for a renewable project. This is a renewable project, Alberta No. 1. We have those 2 sites, and I've already mentioned we're close to transportation. We've got all of the key check marks to make this a commercial project. However, we're having trouble getting off the ground. And it really is getting people to understand what this elephant is, how big it is, how you need to work with that elephant in order to tap all of the positive benefits of geothermal. These are the key points. With geothermal, we can reduce greenhouse gases, we can create jobs, we can attract new industry, we can help in that economic diversification, we can support rural communities, we can do carbon sequestration and mineral production, and it's the greenest of the green. It's base load. That's the key. Base load with 0 emissions. But we have to convince Albertans, and that includes the government and all of you who want to get into this industry, we have to convince them to do things and think about things differently. So we've got the economics are not the same as oil and gas. And that's one of our biggest hurdles, is that oil and gas investors are looking for those quick returns. They're looking to get essentially, their money back in 2 years and probably 45% return on their investment. That is not geothermal. Geothermal is for the patient investor that's looking for a modest return, but they're looking for that return in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and 40 years. There's also social acceptance. Alberta is an oil and gas industry. This is a new industry, and people are afraid in some cases. They think that it's about replacing oil and gas. It is not, and I want to underscore that. We're not replacing the industry. We are only supporting it. It is great in terms of the ESGs. So within geothermal, there's another word. There is enhanced or engineered geothermal systems, EGS. But this is societal, environmental, and governance credits that many large industries need. So geothermal helps them in terms of their ESG credits. There is this technology transition while preserving that core expertise. So that's an important part of what we're going to do. We also need to move the needle on the value of heat, thermal energy. So there's no numbers on the left-hand side of this little bar graph. It's simply meant to represent the value. So if we look at the value of hydrocarbons, they're enormous. They're incredibly important to the economy of Alberta. They need to retain their importance, and that's why geothermal can help them in terms of supporting that part of Alberta's economy. But from the perspective of what we get from our geothermal, the value of electricity is very low in Alberta, and even worse is the value of thermal energy. And that's because our direct competition is in fact natural gas. So how do we overcome this? The other part are really just the more commercial hurdles. It is not easy. So I am Albertan. I was born in Edmonton and raised. I've lived here. I'm actually in Burnaby, British Columbia, and I've lived here for most of, more than 20 years now. But I know Alberta, and I know Albertans, and I know some of the kind of entrenchment that is part of being an Albertan. So we've got these commercial hurdles that we need to get over. And one of the key ones is I think that industry just hasn't fully grasped the long-term implications of the carbon tax. In Alberta, there's been a lot of pushback on the carbon tax, but it is one of the main the most important ways, I believe, in incentivizing new industry like geothermal. So it is very important. We've got these challenging, these low returns up front, but we need to be patient. We need to look for those returns in decade 2. It's seen as as risky, first in kind. So this is something we have to overcome. Institutional investment wants to come in after drilling risk is removed, of course. Skepticism in terms of our ability to build out projects, and the economics, as I said, are very different from oil and gas. The rest are here are really about debt financing. I'm not going to go into those in detail. So the biggest hurdles that we have is the low price of power in Alberta, as well as the low value of heat, because we're directly competing with natural gas. But the other thing for investors is the very high capex of power projects. So this is specifically speaks to power projects. Thermal projects like district heating have a lower capex, a lower hurdle. But I'm using the elephant again to try to get across why geothermal has this huge capex. And Katie put together this very nice little diagram on the left in terms of how much we have to produce in geothermal. So those brines, in order to generate efficiently electricity, we need temperatures of about 110, 120 degrees C, and we need to produce 300 liters per second of brine, and that will get us about 10 megawatts of power. To do that, that's equivalent to 163,000 barrels a day. So it's enough to fill 10. I think there's 10 there. No, 9. Sorry. No, there's 10. Sorry. Olympic-sized swimming pools. Where in the oil and gas industry, if we take a sort of an average well, we're probably producing about 10 liters per second, and that won't even fill one of those Olympic pools a day. So I have likened this to geothermal is this elephant. It's an elephant in the room. It's an elephant in terms of the size of the resource, but also an elephant compared with how we have to handle the fluids. And that's where it is not the same as oil and gas. So oil and gas, that's the Malamute down there and the Arabian horse and the Siamese cat. That's the oil and gas. We are the elephant. And understanding how to move fluids is the most important thing about dealing with geothermal. So how do we get the government to understand this? How do we grow geothermal in Alberta? So not going to focus on this. The important thing about this slide is that the Alberta government has defined geothermal as the naturally occurring heat of the earth. So that means that we can extract that heat, but the new regulations, this Bill 36, if any of you have happened to look at it, give us a challenge because they don't make it clear as to who actually has the rights. I advocate that we should be able to purchase the right to the heat without having to purchase the right to the mineral space, and that minerals being oil and gas or in fact minerals. And I'm going to show you why that is important. But before we do that, just a bit of an overview here. The important thing is that we draw the fluids up from the reservoirs because of the temperatures that we need. We are deep in the system. Our Alberta No. 1, our target is about 3,800 meters. We put it through district heating and then an ORC, and then we put 100% of those brines back into the subsurface. So again, focusing on geothermal is the greenest of the green. It really is something that, in fact, Alberta needs to get on board and get projects going. But this is what it looked like in the past. So investment in geothermal was directly linked to the price of oil and gas. So as crude oil went up, investment in geothermal, because it is another energy source, so oil and gas went up and geothermal went up. Literally 2 years ago now, or a year and a half, there was a disconnect when suddenly this increased interest and the change of thinking of people around the world in terms of the importance of decreasing our greenhouse gas emissions, as well as from a corporate level, increasing our environmental, social, and governance credits. So suddenly people began to realize that geothermal answers not only the GHGs, but also the ESGs for industry. So in Alberta, the map on the right-hand side is the area that's underlain by the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin. And basically, there is usable thermal energy over most of Alberta, all the colored areas. The power production, the temperatures required for power production are only available in the essentially that band of reds and yellows. But even in that band of reds and yellows, it is a challenge because the temperatures that we need are very deep. We've done the economics. We don't think that drilling more than 4,000 meters is economic for a geothermal project in Alberta. So that limits the areas even more and makes it even more important for us to focus on that thermal resource where we have that elephant. So let's talk about this, what the geothermal value chain could look like. So the important thing is that as we withdraw the fluid from the reservoir, and we use it for district heating, and then we use it for power production, we're not impacting that fluid in any way. And we're having a minimal impact on the reservoir. So what else can we do? We're bringing that up to the surface. What can we do with it? So here's just a very, basic schematic. There's our production well, here's our injection well, there's our power generation and our heat exchanger. The problem with this, because of the low price of power in Alberta and the low price of thermal energy, it doesn't excite the investor. We can make this work commercially, but it is not exciting. That's where we need these super patient investors who want a return 10 years and 20 years and 30 years out. But because Alberta is full of investors who are used to making much better rates of return than that, we have to think of something else. Well, one of them is carbon sequestration. So we are down there in the subsurface. Alberta is going to need huge amount of sequestration in order to meet its carbon reduction challenges. If it wants to get on the hydrogen highway, it's going to need sequestration. Well, we are sequestering. And in geothermal, we're drilling these very large wells to do our injection. So we think that we can, in fact, add as a value-added option carbon sequestration to our geothermal process. So just a couple of slides here on sequestration and the really important thing about sequestration. So Alberta, as well as having its enormous oil and gas resources, is also a prime location for sequestration. How do we do that? We also have blue hydrogen. So I don't know how versed you are in terms of hydrogen and what's there's lots of colors of hydrogen, but basically the two colors that are important for the Alberta marketplace are green hydrogen, but in particular blue hydrogen. So green hydrogen is hydrogen which is produced from a renewable power source like geothermal. So the power that we create from our geothermal facility, because it has zero emissions, could be used to create green hydrogen. But the value proposition for Alberta is to take its natural gas and convert that to hydrogen. However, in order to do that, for every kilo of hydrogen produced, there is 3 kilos of CO2 produced, 3 kilograms. So that means the amount of sequestration that is going to be required in order to get on the hydrogen highway is going to be huge. So geothermal can help in that process. The Alberta government just announced that it was seeking $30 billion to work with companies in terms of their carbon reduction plans. And part of that plan is sequestration. So we're hoping that we can, in fact, make that argument, create a geothermal value chain here that includes carbon sequestration. So this is kind of what it would look like. We power generate, we have a heat exchanger, and we also are doing sequestration. And you can see we've done a little play here because we may not be sequestering into exactly the same reservoirs. We don't know exactly how we're going to do this at this point, but that's going to be a focus of research that we're starting right now. I mentioned mineral production. So we're taking those brines. And of course, what's, another hot topic right now is lithium. And there is some, but low values of lithium in oilfield brine. A number of companies are working on how to extract that directly from the brine. And what we're saying is that we're drilling these wells anyway, we're bringing that brine to the surface, we're going to generate power if we can, we're going to have thermal, but we can also take those brines and we can remove the minerals and then pump it all back down. So that's part of our value chain. We can add some solar collector. We could either do solar thermal, which will help us peak up our temperatures a little bit before they go into power generation, or we can produce PV electricity directly and potentially use that to help our help our parasitic load. And like Razor is doing, we can also we can also separate any of the hydrocarbons that we happen to produce. However, our focus is not hydrocarbon bearing units. And in fact, that's one of our challenges because we're looking deep. We need a lot more, we need that heat, and that heat is deep. And that's actually not where most of that's not where the hydrocarbons are. So if we get hydrocarbons, that would be great. We would separate them and use them as a value added, but that's not our intent. Geothermal is also very well suited for microgrids through small industrial clusters. And that's because particularly when we're talking about the thermal energy, you can't transport the thermal energy tens of kilometers like we can power. We can put power on the grid and off it goes, 1,000 kilometers away. Heat, not so much. So we need to focus on smaller footprints and areas like industrial parks or new developments in order to provide them with geothermal thermal energy. So this is kind of the holistic view. This is what we can do with geothermal in specific locations, not everywhere. As I say, some places we don't have power generation capabilities because it's too deep and too costly. We don't necessarily have hydrocarbon that we would separate, but by combining what is appropriate in the particular location, we can start thinking about these industrial clusters or resource parks where we're co-locating industries. And as we co-locate those industries, we're going to supply them with thermal energy as well as power, green power. So let's take a moment and talk about energy and thermal energy. So you all live in Alberta, it's cold there, grew up there. I remember it being very, very cold. In fact, I'm of an age that We got a special certificate from school because we had 30 days of -30 weather. And anyway, I don't know that that's happened for a while, but it's also a little bit of a warning that climate change is here, because we're not seeing those very long periods of cold weather in the winter anymore. However, we're still cold and there's no getting away from it. So what can we do with very copious amounts of energy? And in fact, how cold is it? So when I do this presentation, or something similar about geothermal, to a live audience, particularly a live Canadian audience, I ask them, what do you think the mean annual temperature is for Canada? And most people might say 5 degrees. A couple of times I've heard 3 degrees. Nobody gets that it's 1 degree. And of course, it's 1 degree because we have this huge area in the north where we are in permafrost. And so whenever you have permafrost, you know that your mean annual temperature must be below zero. So all that to say is that there's a huge opportunity here for heat. That opportunity, in fact, is so great that if we look at space heating in Canada, 56% of our energy is used for space heating. So huge requirement. The space heating is very important. That direct use is very important. What can we use it for? Well, lots of things. So obviously we can do community space heating or industrial space heating. You can get pools and spas. But the things that I'd like everyone to think about are things like greenhouses, acres and acres of greenhouse to essentially solve our food security problems. We can do aquaculture. We can dry crops. We can do paper, pulp and paper projects. All of those take relatively low temperature thermal energy that can be supplied by geothermal. Right now, most of this is being supplied by natural gas. So try and get your minds around how much heat. So as I've said, our project is small, Alberta No. 1. We're going to produce 300 liters per second. So small in a geothermal context. We hope our temperatures are going to be 120 degrees C. So that temperature and that amount is equivalent to 40 barrels of oil an hour. So this is not flow. This is in fact the thermal energy that is contained in the water that we're going to pump. And that thermal energy is equivalent to 350,000 barrels of oil a year. Talking about how much brine we're going to be flowing. So this is, again, that 300 liters per second. So that's enough to fill 10 Olympic-sized swimming pools a day, right? That's huge. So again, this gives you an idea. What does that elephant look like? That elephant has a huge volume and it has a huge quantity of heat. So what can we do with it? The important thing, and one of the things that the slide I just realized that I didn't put in here, was heating parking lots and heating snow, heating ice over the winter. That's something that we have enough thermal energy that we can do relatively easily with geothermal. This is the cost. So the other thing that we need to look at from geothermal, so say, let's take those barrels of oil, and if we were heating to give or providing the same amount of heat, but we're going to use barrels of oil, so it's going to take 161,000 barrels of oil to give us 985,000 gigajoules of heat energy. That is actually going to cost us $10 million. So this is over a year. We can sell that heat for a modest amount, and we're going to generate about 3.5 million, a bit more, of heat revenue. But because of those carbon taxes, we're going to also be able to generate some revenue from those carbon taxes. If we look and the important one to look at here is actually the comparison between geothermal and natural gas. So in natural gas, what we're going to pay, so to create that much heat, the 985,000 gigajoules of heat, it's going to cost us about $3 million worth of fuel cost, where we're going to get money. So that is important in terms of trying to make geothermal or making the case for geothermal to be commercial. And let's look the other part of the equation. So I mentioned this at the beginning, is that the other part of the equation is carbon taxes. So a geothermal facility can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, so we get credit for that. And that credit over a year at $50 a ton is worth a little over $2 million. But what companies that are using natural gas, for example, as their fuel, what they are going to be facing is what they're going to have to pay in carbon taxes. So if we look at that natural gas, so they're going to pay in fuel costs about what we're going to make in terms of revenue, but they're going to have to pay an additional $2.5 million. And of course, that is what is kind of rocking the industries that are using natural gas. It's not so much the fuel cost, but it's what they're going to have to pay in carbon taxes and what they're going to have to pay, not this year, but as those taxes increase over time. And again, there's a lot of industries that are fighting it because this has a very significant impact on their bottom line. Obviously, in the geothermal world, in Alberta specifically, it makes our projects commercial, is to be able to have that carbon credit. And what we hope is that more industries, particularly industries that are using natural gas for heating, will understand that their costs are going to increase and that geothermal is potentially an option for them in the future. So let's talk about geothermal in terms of this energy transition. What is the value proposition for Alberta? So these numbers were put together by the University of Alberta, and they think there's about 6,000 megawatts of thermal, and essentially, a little over 1,000 megawatts of electrical. And I think these are fair numbers. They put the emphasis where it should be on the thermal and how we essentially get that thermal energy out there and being used. There are 3 deep and conventional geothermal projects underway in Western Canada. So there's one in Saskatchewan called Deep, and they're about a year ahead of us in terms of Alberta No. 1. There is the Alberta No. 1 project here in the province, and then there's a recently announced one in British Columbia called Clark Lake, which is also in the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin. So all 3 of these projects are delving into the deepest parts of the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin. But we are the first mover in terms of conventional geothermal in Alberta. So how do we build this industry? We need to show that there is a pipeline of projects, that it is not a one-off. Alberta No. 1 is not going to be the last geothermal project. There is a pipeline. We need a regulatory framework that's supportive. We need those carbon taxes. We need, in the Alberta context, to defocus on electrical generation and focus on thermal heating needs. We need to consider that heat is a necessary part of Alberta's infrastructure. We need to recognize that geothermal is just one tool. It's certainly not going to supplant the petrochemical industry, but it is another tool in the toolbox which is going to help us move the energy transition forward. And we need to basically signal government, we need a signal from government that it's willing to have a meaningful conversation with companies like ours who want to move projects forward. We can create jobs, we can show that this basically is just a slide that tells you in terms of how much power, what you can generate in terms of jobs. And, you know, it is significant. It can be significant if we have a big enough build out. We can be an economic driver. We've already talked about that. I just wanted to spend a moment talking about district heating in Europe, because there is wholesale change of their systems from natural gas to geothermal. But the reason they can do it is because it is already part of their culture. They already have significant hot water district heating systems that are currently running on natural gas. That natural gas is coming from Eastern Europe and Russia. And so their main motivation, maybe that's unfair to say main motivation, but certainly one of their motivations is getting that, is reducing their reliance on natural gas and moving to homegrown, basically the heat of the earth. So they have a lot of work right now going on. You're hearing a lot of buzz about essentially making that, converting their systems to geothermal. France and Germany, England, many places that you don't even really think about as being geothermal countries are doing it. So it's simply because of the already entrenched market in district heating. That's why it works in, you know, it's much easier to work in Europe. So this is my goal. What I would like to see in terms of building an industry is that we can produce 3,000 terajoules of clean baseload heat and 500 megawatts of baseload electrical power. And that is a bit higher. So it's not that 6-to-1 that you saw on that original slide. It's, you know, it's a bit different in the sense that, well, actually it's 6-to-1, but that's okay. What I wanted to really focus on here was that we need the electrical generation in order to support the commercialization of the base load heat. So we're going to have to go for those deep hot systems early on in order to essentially show that from a commercial perspective that we make money on electrical power. And then we're going to have to piggyback that thermal piece on that electrical power. So one of the things I was quite shocked with is that one of the companies that we've approached to hopefully invest doubted that in fact there was hot water. And I said to them, I said, well, talk to anybody, a geologist or an engineer or anybody in the drilling industry, and you'll know that one of the major problems in a number of areas of the province is the water, the fluids come out too hot. So we just did a temperature log of an idle well. It was a disposal well held by Secure Energy. So we're very happy and proud for Secure to have helped us in obtaining this log. And what this log shows you is that we were able to confirm at a depth of about 4,000 meters that the temperatures are 118 degrees. That's what we need to produce power. So this was a confirmatory action that we were able to announce last week. And the Premier has gotten on board. He's been tweeting us like crazy. So that's exciting, but we need to see more than tweets. We need to see action. And what that action is more support for geothermal, for these first projects that are trying to get off the ground. If we look at the energy mix in Alberta, then what we see is that, you know, we're not getting away from oil and gas. I mean, oil and gas is going to be there. We need to get away from essentially that reliance, and that reliance in terms of homegrown energy. I mean, not that the natural gas is not homegrown, it is, absolutely, it's below us too, but it's moving more of our energy to geothermal with natural gas as the backup as opposed to the current situation. So that's what we need to do. Just a quick snapshot of the price of power. So this is not about thermal energy, this is about power. And what you'll see here, so this is Lazard, you can look it up. They do these kinds of studies looking at the levelized cost of power. And so there's sort of everything here: solar PV, rooftop, wind, gas peaking, nuclear, coal, gas combined cycle. So everything is here. And what you see important is that geothermal kind of falls in the middle, but it's certainly not at the high end. But it's not at the lowest end. And we continue to be challenged by low-cost solar and low-cost wind. But again, the important thing is we're base load. So what is the Alberta electricity market look like? Snapshot is it's deregulated. So the possibility of getting a higher price for renewable power is just not on in the Alberta marketplace. You know, natural gas, inexpensive natural gas is kind of here to stay. Hopefully it will creep up a little bit, but getting an increase in the natural gas price, I think has a low probability, and certainly power. So what else can we do? Well, we can have that holistic view. We can have projects which have both power and heat as their goal. They can be located close to industrial parks, so we can build out projects. This is just a snapshot of the Alberta No. 1 projects. We're going to that 300 terajoules per year. We can heat 10 acres of greenhouse. We can make 10 megawatts of electricity. That's enough to power 2,500 homes. We've got a couple of MOUs signed with heat off-takers, and one happens to be an industrial composting facility, so a new industry. And, oops, and my timer is just going, and I need to turn it off. There we go. So that's my 45 minutes, and I'm almost finished. You'll be happy to know. So I'm just going to zip through here. We've already talked about the job creation. So we feel that Alberta No. 1 can essentially create about 300 jobs. What's my conclusion? Here's my elephant again. And my conclusion is that we as a company, so Alberta No. 1, Terrapin Geothermics, and all the other companies and the people like you, the young professionals that want to get on, grow this industry, you're going to have to get out there and you're going to have to advocate and be advocates for geothermal so that we can overcome those initial barriers, that high capex, that low and slow return on investment. You're going to have to be advocates to basically help us push geothermal to make this energy transition, because it really does need a push. That's my contact information. You can just Google Alberta No. 1, and I'm happy to receive questions and comments from you. And that's what I'm going to do right now. Is I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Catherine, for that. I would also just like to note that this has been recorded, and I believe there is an intention to post this video online on the Alberta No. 1 website. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, great. So for anybody who wanted to go back and watch this again or reference it to their friends or colleagues, that'd be the right place to look it up, is the Alberta No. 1 website, which you can easily Google. And yeah, that's great. Okay, so for questions and discussion, If you do have any questions, please go ahead and write them out in the chat. Which at the bottom of the screen, there is a chat bubble that you can select and then put your message in there. Alternatively, I do believe that we have the ability to unmute attendants. So if you did actually want to speak, please just raise your hand and we can go into the participants list and unmute you for discussion.
Great. So while we're waiting for somebody to ask a question, the other shout out that I'd like to have is to Geothermal Canada. So we will post this on the Geothermal Canada. So Katie is, as I said, I'm the vice president and Katie is the secretary. So we have a fair amount of clout at the executive table to make make things happen, like posting a video. But it is, so it's not a, Geothermal Canada is not a lobby group. It is a, essentially it's more like a technical organization where we're trying to bring together people who are interested, people and companies and associations and whatnot, who are interested in geothermal, to have the dialogues that are required to essentially, support in terms of technical advancements. It's a group. We're really cheap. Katie, what's our membership now?
The fees or the number?
The fees.
So for individual, it is, I think, $20, or that's a student. And then corporate's $150, and then individuals $40, and then retired's $20.
And really what that does for us is it helps keep our webpage up there. And also, it also links us to the International Geothermal Association. So this is kind of the international, and there's a lot of really important value with that, because this links you to the international community, the people in Germany or France that are working on district heating, the high temperature resources and whatnot. So, just encourage you to reach out and check out the webpage. So I see that I looked at the chat. I can see there's one chat, but I don't see, I can't read it.
If you select the Q&A, actually, there's a section called Q&A at the bottom as well. The question is visible there. I can also read it out loud if you still aren't able to see it, Catherine.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see it now. Thank you for that. So the question is Terrapin also exploring in jurisdictions outside of Canada? So the answer to that is basically no. I mean, Terrapin is an Edmonton-based company that has been focused on waste heat. So waste heat is heat that is generated by some of the petrochemical industry, compressor stations, things like that, currently it's exactly what it says, that waste heat goes up in the air. So they are trying to help in the energy transition by capturing that waste heat and putting it to useful purposes. So their focus is specifically in Alberta, with Alberta No. 1 being their showcase project. But it's not that we're not looking in other places, and certainly because my practice is global, I continue to work on projects actually elsewhere in the world. So we don't have a very ASCII audience here. So I'm going to ask questions of you, Sarah and Andrew and Devika. So tell us a little bit about you and as young professionals, and why you're putting these kinds of talks together and what you hope to accomplish.
Before we do go ahead and answer, Johnny just asked a question, so let's answer his question first.
Okay. Is there much yes, thank you. Is there much collaboration or knowledge sharing between the different projects in Canada you mentioned? Yes. Or has it been, so actually this is a very interesting question. Or has it become commercial enough now that all our competitors? No, we are not commercial. And there's a huge amount of cooperation. But in geothermal in general, there's a huge amount of cooperation. Geothermal is not like the oil and gas industry. And that's actually one of the interesting things that I have encountered is all of the secrecy around oil and gas extraction. Geothermal is, because geothermal, we've always been, like, we are the poor cousins of the oil and gas industry. So the industry has survived by sharing technology, sharing techniques, sharing people, and that sharing is really what has moved the industry forward. So no, there's a huge collaboration. One of Alberta No. 1 people, Juliana Proenza, has just been hired by the Clark Lake project. We routinely use some of the consultants that are working on the DEEP project to help educate us on essentially, what our project is. So lots of collaboration. And I would love it to be so commercial that we're all being, but it's not.